In some ways, there are very few differences in terms of how students write for me. In both cases, there's specialized vocabulary. There's a narrative that has to be addressed. There are authorial techniques that are peculiar to a work and peculiar to a director or to an author. So I don't really teach them differently. What I teach is a specialized vocabulary for film. And of course, film involves different types of techniques that are related to motion. So that's something I do differently. And I do ask students to talk about issues such as camera motion. But then again, they might talk about metaphor in a work of fiction, where they may not as much in a film. With novices who've never taken a film studies course, they'll tend to review the film instead of getting into the technical details. They base their judgments on whether they like the film or not. Perhaps the film emotionally disturbed them or they were bored by it, and that's not a basis for an academic judgment, no more than it is for a work of literature. It might be appropriate for a reviewer, but they're not film reviewers. They are doing film studies work. For more advanced students, it tends to be confusion about terminology and technique. I'll have students confuse shot, scene, and sequence. And I'll have students make mistakes about camera motion. They'll confuse a tracking shot with a pan or a tilt. But those are not very serious errors. Writing enough about film, they can learn those. Well, beyond nowadays being able to incorporate some multimedia, I think there are a few other things. I want them to certainly be able to use the language of cinema knowingly. Also, I want them to get beneath the surface of the film, to think about editing techniques, transitions, the aspects of the film that are more than plot. I really expect them to know something about how a director makes decisions on the set. I always talk about directors as being gods of the set. They can put anything into a film they want if their budget permits it. And then a lot more can be done in the editing process. So I suppose if I were to give you one short answer, it would be to go beyond plot into filmmaking. And that's often what I do, because then, as I've often said, students too often just want to be reviewers. This lets them really become experts at filmmaking. Other than including actual multimedia, I think what a writer has to do when talking about film is to be aware that words alone sometimes can't capture it. That there are aspects of, say, framing a shot where I need to actually see the image. Otherwise, the writer might need 500 words. But there has to be an interplay between image and word in any case. And that requires some subtle writing. I mean, writers have to use not only the film studies techniques really well, they have to employ effective adjectives and adverbs. You can't simply describe a film with verbs of being. You have to use action verbs. Those are all things I look for. But that's only describing the film. In terms of analyzing it, there's so much more. I honestly think that though the techniques of writing about film and literature are fairly similar, it's actually harder to write about film because students think they're more familiar with film than they actually are. They watch a lot of movies, but that doesn't mean that they know how to take a scene apart. One final thing I'll say about that is that I often encounter a problem with novice students as doing film studies work. They don't want to analyze too deeply. They're afraid that the process of analysis will ruin their movie going. And I have to spend a lot of time convincing them, no, it'll deepen your movie going. You'll look at that and say, oh, that's an homage by Quentin Tarantino to a scene in Psycho by Hitchcock. And they'll see it right away and it deepens the movie-going experience. But that's a real trick. And some students just want to just describe the film. So that's one of the challenges I face, where with literature, quite often they've never read the works before. They're coming to it fresh. But they all think they are qualified to be a movie reviewer, and they're not. Students need to learn to communicate in multiple genres and with multimedia. And we don't often enough outside of art history courses stress the visual. And it's a type of learning, and it's one of the major types of learning. There are people who learn verbally, who learn kinesthetically, which is by doing and experiencing, or through their visual sense. So I employ film in literature courses to often communicate a really powerful message. For example, one of my best uses of film ever, And it sounds a little trite at first. When I taught Nietzsche in the core course, I paired it with the film Fight Club. And it made Nietzsche's ideas immediately visible to the students. And then it led to this incredibly nuanced debate using evidence from Nietzsche and using evidence from the film as to whether Tyler Durden was an ascetic priest or whether he was a Nietzschean noble. And they were bringing out the film studies techniques. These are first years, bringing out the film studies techniques, referring to bits of dialogue, giving me direct evidence in a way that I haven't seen in some of my other courses. So the pairing can be really powerful thematically. That's probably the main reason, is because it works so well thematically to pair text and film. One of the things that I do that combines the two activities is to give them a glossary of literary studies and film studies terms, and we talk about them. And I do a demonstration of camera movement, usually using a chair, or sometimes I bring a camera to class and I walk around with it, or I'll put it on the chair and show them how a tracking shot works. I give them a short handout that distinguishes frame, shot, scene, sequence, so that they have some idea about how the editing process puts a film together, which is different from a writerly process in some important ways. So we spend at least a whole class, and then we do a short writing exercise, maybe a scene analysis, to get them ready to really do a longer project about film. But it does take some preparation, as does teaching them the art of literary analysis. If they learn the difference between a simile and a metaphor, or learn how literary allusions work or intertextuality, that all takes time.